Welcome back, Focus Learners. Today, we are diving deep into the fascinating, and honestly, pretty heartbreaking, psychological portrait of King Ludwig II of Bavaria. You can go ahead and consider this explainer your personal director's commentary for your upcoming visit to Neuschwanstein Castle. You know, you're going to be standing right there in those halls in just 2 weeks. And to truly understand what you're looking at, we have to look way past the stone and mortar. We need to look into the mind of the man who built it, a man who essentially lived his entire life as a dramatic, tragic opera. Let's just jump right in with this breathless first impression from the famously controversial composer Richard Wagner. He wrote this right after meeting the newly crowned 18-year-old King Ludwig, and it perfectly sets the tragic romantic tone for the sweeping narrative we're about to unpack. You see, Ludwig wasn't just a king. To many people at the time, he was this ultimate romantic hero. Tall, strikingly handsome, but completely, utterly unprepared for the brutal realities of 19th century politics. Because Ludwig viewed his own life through this lens of theatrical romanticism, we're going to structure our explainer today exactly like a 4-act operatic tragedy. We have Act 1, The Boy and the Swan. Act 2, The Patron and the Maestro. Act 3, Designing the Dream Stage, which is your specific travel guide. And finally, Act 4, the tragic final act.
Act 1, The Boy and the Swan. A childhood steeped in mythology.
We begin our overture at Hohenschwangau Castle, which was Ludwig's childhood home tucked away in the Bavarian Alps. He was raised by incredibly distant parents who believed in very strict discipline. I mean, his father actually once noted that he literally had nothing to say to the boy when they went on walks together. So, naturally, young Ludwig retreated inward. He heavily preferred the company of ancient legends over his own reality. Take the story of Lohengrin, for example, the legendary Knight of the Swan. The walls of his childhood home were practically covered in frescoes depicting this swan knight. Immersed in all this mythology day in and day out, Ludwig really began to blur the lines between theatrical legends and his actual life. And when he finally saw Richard Wagner's opera about Lohengrin at age 15, well, it absolutely changed his life. It was as if all of his childhood fantasies had suddenly come alive right there on stage.
So this sets up a totally devastating psychological split when he finally ascended the throne at just 18 years old. On one hand, you have the crushing reality of the crown. Bavaria was getting dragged into Prussian wars, they were being dominated by Otto von Bismarck, and Ludwig found himself constantly restrained by the strict, boring limits of a modern constitutional monarchy. But then, on the other hand, you have Ludwig's fantasy. He believed deeply, down to his core, in the divine, absolute right of kings. He desperately sought to escape 19th century geopolitics by hiding in the medieval world of Wagnerian operas.
Act 2, The Patron and the Maestro, an obsessive bond with Richard Wagner.
Within a month of taking the throne, Ludwig sent his personal secretary out to find Richard Wagner. And this wasn't just some casual arts funding, okay? This built into an intoxicating, obsessive bond, where the composer literally became the young king's spiritual cure and ultimate escape. Ludwig didn't just admire Wagner, he practically saved him. He immediately paid off all of Wagner's massive, crippling debts. He provided a super generous annual salary, a luxurious villa, and fully funded the creation of absolute masterpieces like the Ring Cycle and Parsifal. We are talking about Ludwig pouring what would be tens of millions of dollars today into Wagner's career. To the young king, Wagner's music was the key to his very delicate inner world. But as you might guess, this incredible level of spending, coupled with Wagner's growing political influence, created intense friction with the Bavarian government. It got so bad they eventually forced Ludwig to ask Wagner to leave Munich. Yet, despite the physical distance, their psychological bond remained totally unbreakable.
Act 3, Designing the Dream Stage, a traveler's guide to Neuschwanstein. Okay, this is where your upcoming trip really comes into play. When you walk through the doors of that castle in 2 weeks, I want you to remember one key thing. Ludwig didn't hire architects to build this place. He hired theatrical set designers. Neuschwanstein is not a traditional defensive fortress by any means. It is the ultimate theatrical stage set, explicitly designed to shelter his fragile mind. I highly recommend you follow this specific sequence of rooms on your tour to truly trace the conflict between his royal duties and his private fantasies. We're going to look at the throne room, the bedroom, and the singer's hall. Keep this progression in mind to really decode the castle.
So, stepping into the throne room, you are going to see this absolutely stunning Byzantine architecture. Look up at the dome and notice all the surrounding murals of holy canonized kings. This whole room emphasizes Ludwig's profound belief in his sacred monarchical authority. But make sure you look for a really crucial detail at the far end of the room. Notice the empty space? There is no throne. He actually died before it was ever finished. So it stands today as this incredibly poignant, accidental symbol of his totally unrealized absolute power.
Next up, as you enter his bedroom, you'll immediately observe this intense, intricate neo-Gothic woodwork and the sweeping wall murals of the tragic romance of Tristan and Isolde. But here's the pro tip. Spot the embroidered lilies. They are subtle, but they are vital cues reflecting his extreme sensitivity and his lifelong obsession with innocence. The sources note that Ludwig was a deeply religious Catholic who struggled with immense guilt over his repressed sexuality. So, those lilies you'll see? They are a direct visual representation of his desperate desire to remain pure and unblemished in a world that he felt was constantly corrupting him. Finally, you'll reach the Singer's Hall. Take a moment to marvel at the murals of Parzival and the Holy Grail. But beyond the paintings, look out for the bizarre artificial grotto built right into the castle. Yes, an actual fake cave inside a castle. It replicates a scene from the opera Tannhauser. Get this, it even originally featured an artificial waterfall and a rainbow machine. I mean, this perfectly shows how Ludwig literally built Wagner's operatic stage sets directly into his living quarters. It was a complete, physical withdrawal from reality.
Act 4. The tragic final act. The conspiracy and the lake.
14 million marks. Just let that staggering number sink in for a second. This completely unsustainable climax of artistic creation eventually had to take a dark turn. The government had finally unequivocally had enough of a king who basically refused to govern and spent all the state's money on fantasy castles. By 1885, Ludwig was 14 million marks in debt. Foreign banks were literally threatening to seize royal properties, which would have been a massive international humiliation for Bavaria. And the king's response to his very concerned ministers? He just threatened to fire his entire cabinet if they didn't magically bail him out. Obviously, this triggered a terrifying constitutional crisis.
The problem for the ministers was that the Bavarian constitution had absolutely no legal provision to depose a monarch just for being bad with money. So the government orchestrated a coup. They assembled a psychiatric panel led by Dr. von Gudden and had them officially declare the king incurably insane. But here's the most shocking part. Dr. von Gudden never actually personally examined Ludwig before making this life-altering diagnosis. It was based entirely on paid servant gossip. We're talking about complaints that the king wore heavy coats in the summer, demanded his hair be curled daily, and liked to dine outdoors in the cold. That's it!
Well, that flimsy diagnosis sparked a brutal rapid-fire succession of events. On June 10, 1886, Ludwig was officially deposed, and his uncle took over as regent. On June 12th, a state commission arrived in Neuschwanstein, arrested the fairy-tale king, ripped him away from his dream castle, and transported him to Berg Castle. Just one day later, on the rainy evening of June 13th, Ludwig and Dr. von Gudden went for a walk together. Hours later, both of them were found dead in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg.
The events that actually transpired in the water that night remain one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. We really have three main theories. First, suicide. This is highly plausible. Ludwig had a documented history of severe depression and was in absolute despair over losing his crown and financial ruin. Second, murder. This one is fiercely debated. Some argue his family or politicians wanted him gone for good to end the financial threat. But historians are quick to point out that since he was already legally stripped of power, murdering him was just an unnecessary, messy risk. And finally, escape. Some believe he was trying to swim across the lake to loyalists waiting on the other side, got into a desperate struggle with the doctor who tried to stop him, and accidentally drowned. The truth is, we may never truly know.
So, as you stand in the majestic, highly theatrical halls of Neuschwanstein in 2 weeks, walking through the very stage sets of a man who quite literally couldn't bear to live in the real world, I leave you to ponder this final, unresolved mystery. When the curtain finally fell on the tragic opera of King Ludwig II, was it suicide, an escape gone wrong, or murder? Keep that question rolling around in your mind as you look out over those beautiful Bavarian Alps. Enjoy your trip, Focus Learners, and I will see you in the next explainer.